welcome to CIVIQ. This is a wonderful speaker series that we've now hosted for 6 years. And my name is Eric Myers. I'm the director of the Chattanooga Design Studio. We are the host organization. We're a nonprofit urban design resource for the community, and we are the host organization of CIVIQ. So if you're new to CIVIQ, don't make this your last time here. Coming back and visit us. It's a quarterly event, and a quarterly speaker series. First and foremost, would like to thank the Lyndhurst Foundation for the generous support, ongoing support, really, for 6 years for this program. 6 full years of a quarterly speaker series being funded by the Lyndhurst Foundation is a fantastic, generous support for the studio, for our community. We couldn't do it without their generous support. A little bit about the Chattanooga Design Studio, if you don't mind, please. We are a nonprofit, and through our mission, we seek to elevate the quality of life for all citizens here in Chattanooga through the guidance and collaboration and innovation and education that promotes livable and accessible and walkable and humane urban design. And we do that only through really a qualified and dedicated staff, and we would not be doing the excellent work that we would be doing here in the community without Sydney Smith here in the front row, and Ritika Narang, who's taking a picture right now, and Shelby, our fall intern, and Jack Wood is here. Jack, where's Jack? He's checking people in. Jack was at the check-in table. You've all met Jack. Ginger Birnbaum in the back, Outreach and Development. And where's David Chalker? David's in the back. David Chalker. You should know our staff. You should know everyone. They're dedicated. And I've always said, I say it often, that it's just wonderful to work with people that show up with a purpose and care for this community. You should know that. You should know that the staff has the utmost care for our work and how it has generational impact in the community. If you would, please allow me to make a few shameless plugs about our work. We are keenly focused on several initiatives in our community right now, several opportunities too, if you will. In this slide, you can see 2 of our initiatives that we're working on in this the beautiful scenic city. We're focused right now, and with partnership with the Parks and Outdoors Department and the River City Company, on the riverfront park spaces and how those riverfront park spaces all work in concert with Broad Street, which is a linear spine, to work in a big notion of a public space system that connects the heart of our city really to our riverfront, and what are the opportunity for those spaces to really reach their full potential for generations to come. If you have any questions about that work, please, and any of the work I'm going to share tonight, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Any one of our staff, we're so approachable and would love to spend time with you and get any input that you might have and any insights that you might have about this work. Of course, you may have seen the paper just recently. We've been working for over a year with the primary leaseholders and the community and stakeholders for a unifying vision for Montague Park. It's 45 acres right in the heart of what I call the urban valley. So that's Missionary Ridge to the river, and the river really to North Georgia. Montague Park sits right in the heart of that, and it's 45 contiguous acres that we will not get another opportunity like this of contiguous green space in our community to combine food and local food and youth sports and world-class art exhibit, and the ability to reforest our city and to add to the urban tree canopy that we know we desperately need, and to also alleviate stormwater and water quality issues that exist and are persistent within the urban valley. So this is an incredible opportunity for our community. We've unveiled this unifying vision with our partners, with Sculpture Fields at Montague Park, and with the Chattanooga Football Club in recent months, at the end of last month actually, and look for more to come. Again, as I said earlier, if you have any input and you have any feedback that we need to hear about, please don't hesitate to reach out with us. So, while we're all here together tonight, and I have the great honor to introduce you Chandra Rouse. She is the senior manager at the Equitable and Sustainable Communities at Metropolitan Planning Council, the MPC in Chicago, and she's an urban planner in Chicago currently. She leads the Change Lab initiative, and the Change Lab initiative really helps equip community-based organizations, public sector officials and public sector leaders lenders and business owners and community, private sector actors, to move through system change in the community. And what that means is really particularly in housing and transportation systems, what that might mean for the Chicago area to fabricate and coexist and co-create change at the speed of the community. And I think this is really inspiring work, and that we can lean into hearing Chandra's efforts in the community. But not only is she an excellent urban planner in this regard, she also is a community creator. And her book, Where the Sidewalk Grows, is really interesting to hear about, and I hope we hear more about that tonight, because it really takes a way for this interdisciplinary work to find its way through education of people of all ages, really, and how our communities could collaborate in a real meaningful way across many different languages, and that how we find culture and history finding itself and its best self is through community collaboration. And I think Where the Sidewalk Grows is a novel example of that. And so, Chandra, I really am honored to have you here tonight, and I hope you come to the stage. And please give Chandra a Chattanooga welcome with me.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Or we are in a southern city, so good evening. All right. So again, my name is Chandra Rouse, and I am so honored to be with you all here tonight. And what I've learned is the great big town of Chattanooga. I first would like to thank the Chattanooga Design Studio. I received such a warm welcome to this city even before stepping foot here. So thank you to David, Eric, Ginger, and this amazing team for the invitation. I've gotten a chance to learn from the Erica, Miss Linda, and Rita. Thank you so much for your support. So the title of my talk this evening is Designing Disruption, What If We Did Fix It? So if you're wondering what the it is, and if you're in the right place, you are welcome. We will get into that in a minute. And if this is your first time thinking about designing disruption and systems change work, I'm so happy you're here. If you've been working on disrupting the status quo and addressing systemic inequities for many years now, it's good to see you again, my friend. No matter where you are on your journey of creating a world where more of our systems work for more people, thank you for thinking about these issues, showing up for these issues, caring about these issues. I hope to leave you all with a few more tools and a little bit more fuel in this work. Throughout my talk, I will share different types of disruption that I've been designing over my career, using the framing disruption as blank. But before I begin, I want to share what brought me to this work of designing disruption, and more specifically, who. So, I want to take you all back to 1981, to a boardroom in Los Angeles, California. My mom had just graduated from college, and she was sitting in that boardroom in LA as a part of an orientation meeting for a fast-track bank management program. This photo that you see was taken the morning of that orientation meeting. So she has her favorite blue dress on, has her briefcase, ready for her first big girl job. So my mom and 10 other participants in that bank management program arrived that morning to a room of bank executives, and they started their presentation. And in their opening remarks, they shared, giving Black people higher interest rates on mortgages is the cost of doing business. Giving Black people higher interest rates on mortgages is the cost of doing business. So my mom started to raise her hand, and then she remembered the words of her mother, my grandmother. My grandmother said, "Don't make waves. I can't always protect you." This is my grandmother and grandfather. You see, for my grandmother, the bank is what allowed her to stay in her home. My grandmother was a teller at that exact same bank company where my mom's orientation was at. And my grandmother used her paycheck to raise my mom and her 2 siblings with my grandfather in their home just an hour north of LA in a much more racially integrated and newly formed city of Oxnard, California. But for my mom, that bank is what kept other Black families from accessing homeownership in the much more racially segregated and much older city of Los Angeles. My mom was a community organizer, and she lived in LA with her other recent college grad friends and other community organizers. She used the information from those meetings at the bank to strategize on how to organize against the bank and their harmful practices, from discriminatory policies to investing in the apartheid in South Africa. My mother was grateful for my grandmother's sacrifices and paid it forward in her commitment to her community. So my mom gripped her briefcase tightly, and she raised her hand. She raised it high and asked the presenter and other bank executives if what they were describing in their opening remarks was redlining. The presenter smiled, turned to the other program participants, and announced it was time for a break. So there was one other Black woman in that bank management program besides my mom, and they actually both had the same first name, but they pronounced it differently. And the bank executives, they didn't bother with learning how each of these Black women pronounced their first names. So instead, they called my mother by her last name, Christmas. So at the orientation meeting, they pulled my mom to the side and they said, "Now, Christmas, we don't really like to use that word. It has kind of a derogatory meaning." My mom looked out across the boardroom to the other program participants, and they avoided eye contact. So the bank executive started again. "So Christmas, we're going to be focusing our Q1 lending on these neighborhoods that are considered low risk." And they began circling parts of Los Angeles on a map. My mom refocused her gaze to the two men in front of her, and she watched as they drew a line. And on one side, outside of that circle, was the neighborhood that my mom and her friends and fellow organizers and majority Black residents lived, high risk. On the other side of the line, inside of the circle that they drew, was a neighborhood that was whiter, richer, wealthier, low risk. But all my mom could see was this, with a new name. This is the original redlining maps of Los Angeles, California, and they were created by a government-sponsored corporation called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it was created as a part of the New Deal in the 1930s. So they created these maps to assess the risk for real estate investment using 4 grades, where red was considered the most hazardous based on its proximity to what they called Negro infiltration and also other Eastern European races. Redlining was one of the key ways in which explicit racial practices were made systematic by making lending race neutral through geographic assignments of risk, transforming it into structural racism. So that's how we go from interpersonal bias to structural racism. It's what allowed those bank executives to make that map not about race, but instead about the cost of doing business. My mom told me that story almost 30 years after that orientation meeting. My parents had just bought a new home right outside of the southeastern part of Washington, D.C., in a city called Temple Hills, Maryland. I had just finished middle school. And hearing that story was the first time that I had started to unravel this American dream of homeownership. My family's ability to buy our home was about the cost of doing business. Home became conditional. It was on the conditions of how someone in that boardroom in 1981 perceived our risk level. What I know about housing comes from what I know about home. I'm a 4th-generation homeowner, but my mother might be the 1st generation in our family to pass down a home. My work is from what I learned from my mother and my grandmother. It is from all the homes that I have watched enter our family that we have fought to keep and that we keep losing. I have watched how my grandmother and my mother preserved the dignity of our home in the face of systems that did not recognize the worth of the home or the people in them. My existence is because of their resistance against institutions that devalued Black lives, Black neighborhoods, and Black dreams. My family's story is not the exception, but the rule of the American dream. Homeownership and the type of power and privilege needed to afford it, keep it, and pass it down is by design exclusive and precarious. The few exceptions to that rule will make you think it has changed, when it has only further entrenched that you must be proximate to power and privilege to be let in. By design, my family belonged outside of that circle that those bank executives drew on those maps, even as we have gotten close to it. I have not stopped thinking about that line and what happens after we expand it, and how we get to the work of designing disruption and erasing that line. So tonight, I will share a few lessons on how we get there and how we get there together. Is that all right? All right. So we now know this lending strategy that my mom witnessed in its more accurate name: contract buying, block busting, urban renewal, predatory lending, and of course, redlining. So this is the original redlining map of Chattanooga. I want you all to reflect on the racial demographics of the city today. How is it different from this map? How is it the same? Redlining has shaped the American South, where we are tonight, as much as it has shaped the city that I now live in, Chicago. While in grad school, I learned about the history of Chicago and many other cities, but it was always told from the perspective of those who removed resources. I wanted to better understand the power that communities formed as resistance and the institutions that they created in the face of disinvestment. It was that very power that it took my grandmother to keep going back to that job as a teller at the bank, no matter how she was treated. It was that same power that it took my mom to quit that job in the bank management program, move across the country to the seat of power, and work in Congress. The first disruption that I'm going to share tonight is disruption as language. So this project is from 2017, during my time in academia as a researcher in grad school. After my first year of grad school, I had traveled for the first time to Chicago to study both the historical and contemporary examples of how communities built that power with each other. So not just power over, but power with, and how they countered various forms of spatial violences like disinvestment and built their own institutions and what the planning field could learn from them. So I would often see this sign. This is a sign created by the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Development. And it left me questions like, what do we mean by a new Chicago? Who's considered old? Which neighborhoods are modern? Which ones are not modern? Are these livable wage jobs? Where is this investment coming from? What do we mean by our future? But most importantly, I was thinking about whose spatial imaginary were we living in? Who had imagined this old Chicago, and who gets to imagine this new Chicago? As I explored how communities were responding to these questions, I would also see images like this. This is from Chicago-based poet, artist, and singer Jamila Woods and her music video, Giovanni. I became enthralled by this image. The model of downtown Chicago was familiar that she's holding. The person staring back at me, Jamila, was familiar, but the positionality of the two was not. Jamila was holding the city, but was it a loving embrace? Were she and the city wrestling? In that moment, this iconic skyline of downtown Chicago was no longer a city. It was another being. It was a being that Jamila loved and cared for enough to be reimagined, and that's all that mattered. Her lyrics from her album entitled Heaven and the visuals like this one pushed me to reimagine what a Black woman's relationship to the city could be. I saw the ways that she and so many other Black women artists were reimagining the city through different practices. I saw this disjuncture between the rhetoric of planning evidenced in that sign and the vision and imaginary of these women that they were creating through their practices. I could see these material, conceptual, and imaginative maps in extraordinary ways, but why wasn't this a part of our collective understanding of urban planning? I wanted to address this disconnect and disrupt how we understand planning and what we define as planning strategies, and also who gets to imagine a new future for our cities. So the title of my research project was called Race, Space, and the Poetics of Planning Toward a Black Feminist Space-Making Practice. And I created the term poetics of planning, which I define as a language rooted in art and expression of culture, because I wanted to provide a vocabulary for a discussion and exploration of Black women's creative approaches to building a new Chicago and offer a model for both reading and analyzing their practices like this as urban planning strategies that we as built environment practitioners could learn from. So first, let's talk about what is space making, as I mentioned in the title of this. So a core part of this research project was to identify the necessity of putting spatial theorists and sociologists like Henry Lefebvre in conversation with Black women geographers like Catherine McKittrick and Black feminists like Bell Hooks. So space making refers to Lefebvre's production of space. And so there's this production of three notions of space where I begin to conceptualize space making. So the first is around experience. So this refers to spatial practices that are physical spaces. This is about our everyday routines, and the case study that I used for this project is from a collective, so you see on the top bar here, called Party Noir. They're an inclusive cultural hub that celebrates Black femmes, queer women of color, and Black womanhood across the gender spectrum. The second form of space making that I looked at was perception. So this is about representations of space. So think about murals where you have a physical space being represented. So this is about how we understand space in our designs, our codes, our plans, how we conceptualize space. And so one of the case studies that I used was Color Theory by artist and architect Amanda Williams, where she repainted and photographed 8 vacant homes in the South Side neighborhood of Englewood in Chicago using this culturally charged palette. And her goal was to draw attention to the issues of both disinvestment and underinvestment in Black neighborhoods in Chicago. The last type of space-making practice that I looked at was imagination. So this is representational space. This is about spaces of imagination in which we live. So the example that I used here, one of the case studies was from writer, sociologist, and professor Dr. Eve Ewing and her poetry book called Electric Arches, which is an imaginative exploration of Black girlhood and womanhood through poetry, visual art, and narrative set in the streets of the 1990s in Chicago. So how does that then differ from placemaking? So you all might be familiar with street activations. You might think of painting on streets as one approach to placemaking. So I wanted to distinguish between the temporality of placemaking, right? These are usually temporary events that might be pop-ups on streets. But space making for me, this is about how do you move through an entire city. So not just for a particular event or a particular moment. Beyond that moment, how do you show up in a city? How do you show up in your body as a being? And how do you also create these different modes of space that I mentioned? So rather than tell you all the case studies that I looked at as a part of this work, I wanted to create a more accessible medium than the 100 pages that I wrote on this. So I created a short film that I overlaid with video footage of some of the case studies and the audio from interviews. So I'm going to highlight one example.
But all of the traditional art institutions, I ain't never felt comfortable. In this way, I am such a very typical Black kid from the South Side. Like, I grew up knowing I was interested in art, but we did not access those places to fulfill our artistic desires. That was not where it was happening. It was like, nah, we create spaces. Like, this little spot, Lit X, that opened up in Wicker Park. Like, we all gonna go there. This little club, like, we created space. We did not, museums. So now that I'm in these spaces speaking, it's still very weird for me. So when we started the Englewood Rise and Billboard project, and then subsequently my 2 photography projects that led to my Everyday Englewood exhibition at Loyola prior to Folded Map. We were all in the community like, we have to shift the narrative, we have to reclaim the narrative. But as a result of my practice and engagements with Folded Map, we were able to kind of interrupt the media space in which we felt we were being attacked. So as a result, we were able to have the larger conversation of why it's a news story. It's a news story because you don't see images like this. Why don't you see images like this? Forget shifting the narrative. Forget that. That's like 2015. Like, you gotta change the narrator.
So I'll share a link to the full film after this, but the voice that you heard was from Tanika Lewis-Johnson. She was one of the case studies of perception. So again, this is representations of space. And I coded her photography work in this category because, as she described, she was challenging how the media represented her neighborhood, and she goes on to share the economic impact of those perceptions. I wanted to capture the spatial strategies that she articulated when she was describing why she took up space on those billboards to counter those media portrayals and what the planning field could learn from her strategies. And again, I'll share all the full recommendations and findings from that research after. So the next disruption I want to talk about is resource flow. So this is a project example from when I worked with the City of Chicago's Department of Housing in 2019 on a racial equity impact assessment that examined the city's tax incentives to construct and rehab affordable rental housing for low-income households, and created recommendations on how we allocate these tax incentives. And I want to begin by sharing a little bit more about the housing landscape in Chicago so you all can see how it might be similar or different from the landscape here. So in Chicago, we've had substantial declines in affordable supply, might be familiar to you all, and it has led to one of the highest affordability gaps in at least a decade. So this affordability gap is calculated by comparing the demand for rental housing for lower incomes earning 150% of the federal poverty line, which as of 2021, this is about 41,000, and the supply of units that would be affordable at 30% of that lower incomes household, which is about 1,000 per month. And as of 2021, Chicago has seen roughly a 15% decline in that affordable supply since 2012. So this graph is from the Institute of Housing Studies at DePaul University, and it shows changes from 2012 to 2021 in supply and demand. And further research shows that that difference in demand for rental that qualify as affordable in the city of Chicago exceeds the supply by about 120,000 in 2021. So this affordability gap of about 120,000 homes is one measure that we have of need around housing assistance in the city. And one of the tools that we have to address this is our low-income housing tax credit, known as LIHTC. So the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is designed to provide incentives to the private sector to develop affordable rental housing. The Qualified Allocation Plan, known as QAP, I'll just take you all through some alphabet soup, is a set of recommendations to guide LIHTC developers through the process of acquiring tax credits for producing affordable rental housing. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, again LIHTC, is one of the largest funding sources for the development of affordable housing. So Chicago is unique in that we're one of the few jurisdictions nationwide that has its own tax credit allocation authority, in addition to the state of Illinois. Also, between 2000 and 2020, the city's LIHTC program allocated tax credits to either develop or preserve about 10,000 low-income units across the city. And also 2017 was a turning point for us for our qualified allocation plan, our QAP. It shifted from a much more broad call to a lot more specific criteria around priority census tracts that underscore the preservation for existing housing and the development of more community amenities. And the image that you see here is an example. This is housing specifically for artists. And so these are the types of amenities that would be incentivized through our qualified allocation plan. So we wanted to do this racial equity impact assessment on the QAP because it's a pretty powerful lever that the city has. So one, it can influence who's served. So this might look like the type of marketing that's done. Also scrutiny around how developers manage wait lists, their application process. It can also look at how developers report demographics about tenants. That's a whole other issue around what data we can actually report on. It can look at sizes of units, also how people are served. It can help incentivize supportive services, like things that promote economic mobility or mental health services, for example. It can look at where units are preserved, so the location of them, also weigh various goals around revitalizing versus stabilizing, and also look at who's involved in the not only development, but designing and building. So what are the groups that are subcontracted out? So these are all the different things that this set of instructions can help to shape. And just a little bit more about some of the research findings that we looked at as a part of this. So you'll see a majority of the LIHTC units were considered new construction. So we were able to make some types of conclusions around the type of housing that it was helping to incentivize. We also looked at where the percentage of them were located in terms of our opportunity areas. So these are areas that promote mobility to some extent. And then we also looked at sizes of units and how that matched the need specifically around our Latinx populations, which we had to use state data since we couldn't get city data around this. So again, that was some of the initial research that we did for this project. So a little bit more about what a racial equity impact assessment is. So it's a process through which a set of questions are developed and posed to stakeholders to investigate the benefits and burdens of some type of policy or practice. The City of Chicago's working definition of racial equity at the time when we did this project is a future state where race is no longer a predictor of outcomes. So we really push them to think about both a process and outcome as a part of this. It can also be the REIA, specifically Racial Equity Impact Assessment, can also be used as a tool to identify new options for how to remedy longstanding inequities. So it begins with identifying, again, a question that you have, some type of proposal. We also did deep community engagement, so we had focus groups with developers, with service providers, property managers, residents. We then were able to develop a set of recommendations, how we were going to track data, how we were going to measure this. These are all the different steps involved in these type of assessments. So a part of my contribution to this project was that I developed 6 fictional characters and 8 stories about how they connected to the low-income housing tax credit program to present our recommendations. I wanted to demonstrate the intersectionality of the many ways that this program can reproduce racial inequities on both the development side and the resident side. And this particular narrative tool of user personas are usually developed through direct engagement. So I was pulling direct quotes from the focus groups that we facilitated, both online and in person. And we were able to explore different scenarios through each of the characters' view to inform more of a robust solution. So I specifically wanted to use this narrative tool for policy change because the more specific we can be about the problem that an end user is experiencing, the better we can develop these tools to solve for that issue. It also allows us to move past stereotypes and focus on the whole person while we recognize that we can't comprehensively connect everything to a person's lived experience in affordable housing. It can present an opportunity to ground decision-making in the complex and intersectional lives of residents. It also helped us to identify shared barriers and goals across different stakeholders that need to be engaged. and also right to the breadth of end users, not just a single decision maker, like someone in government, for example. And we also wanted to use storytelling as a way to connect and motivate change. So meet our residents, starting with Joe. He has more than 20 years of development experience. He's responsible for a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of residential, mixed-use, and adaptive reuse properties. His company has been awarded low-income housing tax credits for the past 15 years, and he's a resident of the north side of Chicago. Meet Tony. She's our property manager at one of Joe's LIHTC properties. She works in a predominantly Spanish-speaking neighborhood, but she herself does not speak Spanish. On the northwest side is where this property is located. Meet Brandon. He has about 5 years of development experience, 4 years of finance. He has an active pipeline of almost $1 million with 40 units. He has applied a number of times for these tax credits, but keeps getting denied. He's a resident of the south side of Chicago. Meet Randy. He's Brandon's dad. He lives in a LIHTC property with his wife for over a decade in a predominantly black neighborhood on the west side of the city. Meet Isabel. She has 3 sons and an elderly mother. She was recently evicted from her last apartment because she could not keep up with rising rents on the northwest side of the city. She began working a second job to increase her income. She's looking for a LIHTC property, has called Tony a number of times, but there's a language barrier there. She's specifically looking for a wheelchair-accessible unit for her mother and also access to childcare for her sons. Meet Luis. This is Isabel's brother. He has lived in a LIHTC property on the southwest side of the city for about 5 years, predominantly Latinx neighborhood. He's a veteran and has post-traumatic stress disorder and also a prescription drug addiction. So you might know a Tony or maybe a Luis. You might feel connected to Brandon's story of starting a new career path and getting denied, or maybe Isabel's story of caring for an aging parent. Or maybe you don't know any of these residents, but you recognize your biases when you meet a Joe. Maybe you make assumptions about who he is, or you meet a Randy and check your own biases around who that person is. And I really wanted to think about how do we build differently when we address residents as people, whole people, instead of solely as data points and disparities. So the 8 narratives that I wrote as a part of this highlight specific issues based on this racial equity impact assessment that we did and research, including who benefits, who disproportionately is burdened by this policy, and wanted to both divide those recommendations by a time frame, so what is short-term versus long-term, and also what can be directly addressed by the QAP, because again, this is one lever that is influenced by a number of levers in the city, so what is complementary to that. And I won't go through all the recommendations, but again, we'll provide a link to the full report where you can see how we connected each of our 8 recommendations to narratives about the residents that I just shared. So lastly, I want to talk about a disruption, which I'm calling systems change making. So as I mentioned, I worked very closely with the Department of Housing as a part of that last project, and the department has been particularly successful in this effort of being able to create more of an explicit equity focus on tax credits. They also, with support of a lot of federal funding, were able to make the largest investment to date in affordable housing. And it was very clear that the department knew why this work matters, but the questions that they were left with was how do we sustain and expand this work to other policy levers that the department has. And I wanted to work more closely with the people that make up these systems and really help them get in better relationship with change, because that's a lot of what the work was on the backside of this, thinking not only about how are we engaging with community, but how are we helping government to think differently about these issues. And I recognize that takes practice to get comfortable with change. The department understood these challenges, but didn't know what comes after these policy recommendations and wins. And so I wanted to think about how do we better connect both policy change with the culture change needed in a department, as well as the process and protocol changes needed for this work. So I started to sit with the questions that the department posed to me, as well as a number of other questions I've gotten in my work. And I was left with these kind of 3 buckets of questions. So the first is thinking about, what makes this work so difficult is that we're deeply embedded, particularly for folks that are in institutions, so deeply embedded in the very systems that they're organizing to change. And so partners shared that they need more support on how to do their work differently. The second question was really about how these institutional players wanted to be more collaborative with community and those with lived experience, but really understood that there's a history of harm there and a lot of trauma. And so how do we move through that knowing there's a lack of trust that those institutions have directly caused or been complicit in? So what does it look like to actually move to a place where you can meaningfully share power with folks? And lastly, we recognize that folks need to be creative, right? And so we need to think about how the tools that got us here will not be the tools that undo this work. And so how do we actually de-risk creativity and create spaces for folks to test out ideas and quickly iterate? So the vision that my team and I put forth was a training and learning initiative called Change Lab, which Eric spoke about. And the vision of this is to equip our advocates, so our community-based organizations, private sector, these are our government folks, policymakers, and our private entities, so our lenders, our banking, our financial institutions, with the knowledge, skills, and tools to affect structural change and institutionalize equity. So our approach to this work is first helping folks to understand what is their role in systems. How do we increase your awareness of how you are part of these systems and get out of your own way? So really about how do you shift your role once you have a deeper understanding of it, because our systems are just made up of people. Secondly, we have co-create. So this is about how do you build the relationships needed to create our most transformative solutions. So again, what is the work needed to be able to share power with folks to co-create solutions? And then lastly, how do we experiment? How do we specifically look at experimenting with creative approaches and de-risking innovation so that we could do more of this iterative prototyping and testing out of ideas? So this is kind of where all of our systems change-making curriculum comes together. So one thing we learned in this process, specifically working with government, is that it's important to think about how in this, specifically what time, resources, and capacities our partners have to thinking about this work. So we wanted to break down this process in what can be addressed in what time frame, because folks are like, can we fix it in a month? No. So how do we actually move them through this process to be like, well, how much time can you give us? Oh, 1 to 6 months? We can teach you some things, right? But you're gonna have to work with us for a little bit more, like a year, to actually dig into where that institutional harm was, right? Really thinking about unlocking that part of this and then moving you into a place where you have a learning partnership. So our first bucket pathway around this are our workshop series. So this is our convenings with facilitated discussions. And this is really about giving folks a teaser for what this framework looks like and then providing hands-on tools. So we have been doing this most recently with housing stakeholders. This includes lenders, realtors, policymakers, residents, bringing them into a room together and really doing more of our learning and deep understanding work. Next, we have our community of practice. So this is a project we're leading right now that I'll touch on more, which is about a space for partners to learn from and with each other to identify a structural inequity and develop a solution. So we're doing that work with lending and counselors. And then lastly, our learning partnerships. So this is 1 to 3 years. This is the work we've been doing with our Department of Housing and Department of Planning and Development. And again, really at the core of this work is that systems change requires an intervention from multiple angles, rethinking both policy, process, and culture that underpins these systems. So I'm gonna highlight one example of how we do this work. So in specifically our workshop series work, we heard very clearly the need to create intentional disruptions in how we build purchasing power for residents of color. So this is your debt and equity when you're coming to buy a home. Building local purchasing power for prospective homeowners of color is specifically empowered by a strategic relationship between lenders and our community-based organizations that have counselors. Often those financial institutions will work with CBOs to just market the benefits of homeownership and just dump off products and then leave it up to counselors to figure out how to actually absorb that capital into communities and think about how to make it working capital. And so it's always after those products have been fully designed and developed. And so we saw that this creates products that are inaccessible for a lot of residents. And so we wanted to strengthen pathways of collaboration between our lenders and our housing counselors during that planning and design phase. We saw that as critical. But given the power imbalances between these two stakeholders, long history of harm, that collaboration we saw requires extensive relationship building, trust rebuilding, and skill building. So we work with folks to really be able to equip folks with those skills and tools with the hope that these lending products by the end of this process we're building will better reflect the realities of navigating such an inequitable homeownership system. So we partnered with a local foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, and they're providing grant funding for 4 project teams that each have 1 lender and 2 housing counselors to go through a community of practice that we're facilitating in order to design a more equitable lending product. So we're investing in people and a process to get to better outcomes. And so this is just to offer a visual of what our curriculum roadmap looks like. We're going to be talking about systems thinking, collaboration, and narrative and culture change. So this is just a teaser of some of the topics we go over: power sharing, mapping policy influence, thinking about collaborating with multiple stakeholders as a part of this. So again, we're just embarking on this vision, but excited to keep building this curriculum roadmap and thinking about implementation. Okay, that was a lot. So what if we did fix it? So the it part of this sentence, I shared a little bit more about systems change, housing work that I've done historically in this, but this is really for you all to figure out, right? But the what if part of it is for us to figure out. We don't often think about what comes next because we don't often think that we can fix it. So how would we build and fix differently if we actually believed that we could fix it? Maybe we would design language that affirms our humanity and holds the richness of our dreams. Maybe we would design resource flow for more than just resident needs, but the intersectional lives that they live. Or maybe we would design systems change that addresses longstanding policy, process, and culture that has allowed these inequities to exist for far too long. I think we need to be arrogant enough to believe that we have what it takes, but humble enough to fail, like raising your hand in a boardroom. And I believe that there is no way forward unless we tell the truth about how we got here and understand our past. So in Chicago, Los Angeles, Chattanooga, perhaps the cities that you all call home, we have a city that was planned and developed within the confines of fear. Centuries of racist governmental policy and lending disparities have led to systematic neglect and removal of resources in our neighborhoods of color. We have witnessed the efficacy to intolerate the intolerable over and over and over again. Millions of decisions created the injustices that we see today, but for every decision, someone could have raised their hand, and there could have been another. Addressing injustice demands a disruption. Development with the displacement of legacy Black residents was normal. Undervaluing our Black and brown neighborhoods was normal. Not lending to our low to moderate income residents of color was normal. Our normal development processes have put a price on our imagination. It is up to us to decide whether to imagine disrupting the status quo and succeeding, or to imagine recovering some notion of normality. So I want to leave you all with an invitation to imagine a world where we fixed it. What choices would we make? What risks would feel worth it? And do we have the courage to keep that vision even when we are afraid? We now find ourselves confronted with the potential for transformation. Our inequities like housing insecurity and lack of affordability will only increase if we do not make changes at the systems level. This moment can be a mandate for a future of development where Black life, Black neighborhoods, and Black dreams matter just as much as a building. but we decide which imagination to use. So let's decide, and let's start with thinking about how disruptive we will be. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I had a conversation with Advantage Capital recently, which is it's a fund that is trying to solve some of these problems, and they were saying that LIHTC is like the smallest little solution that is not nearly like to the scale of the problem. So I'm curious, have you seen any good kind of market players that are not focused on the tax credits necessarily, but that are coming in with market-based solutions to try to figure out how to make these projects pencil in, like he was saying, and I see this in Chattanooga, that all the development capital is going towards the high-end stuff, and that's where the developers say they have to build there, supposedly, to make any money. I mean, is that true? Is that people just not being curious enough? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think whenever people tell me they can't pencil it, I'm like, well, show me the math, right? Like, and I think part of that is that I understand real estate development finance, but I understand that's not everyone's strength. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly going to need to be more creative, and it's a very antiquated system, but it is part of what we do have access to now. I think some promising examples that I've seen in Chicago is really thinking about community ownership models, so land trusts, housing cooperatives. I think our financial institutions are catching up to what does it mean to actually be able to share, like be a shareholder in this or do some type of joint venture. And so I would say those are particular models that I've seen promising, but it's completely different type of capital stack to have multiple people and thinking about risk involved in that. So I would say it's going to be a mix of just new, completely models for how we think about real estate.
So, in thinking about, I know this is, my question is not directly related to housing, but it is about disruption and investing in community. And in terms of about Chattanooga, and one of the things that we really struggle with here is our public transportation system is locally underfunded and not particularly equitable or accessible. So in thinking about the work that you're doing, is that something that you're considering? I mean, again, that's not housing, but it's directly connected to equity in our lives.
Yes. So another hat that I wear in Chicago is co-chair of a collaborative called Elevated Chicago, where a group of multi-sector partnerships that are looking at getting more investment around public transportation, but also investing in public transportation. And I think we have developed a model for community-led development and also at its core an organizing strategy to get more investment to transit. So I would say that is one blueprint that I'm really proud of that we have been able to build in the city. But again, I think part of how we even started that work was developing what we call our e-hubs, which are looking at a half-mile radius around transit stops and organizing the different community groups to say you all have something to gain from specifically investing in this asset. And so I think if you could start there as like an organizing strategy to say we all have a vested interest in this bus line working better or even just arriving at all, like how can we say, what does that mean to each of us? So then you can talk to, well, there is a child care center that says, I need parents on that bus. Oh, well, there's a grocery store saying my cashier has used that bus. There's residents that are saying I use this to get to work. So I think starting with that framing as an organizing strategy of what does this asset mean to you and being able to take that to policymakers is where we started to build now what we have as a huge organizing effort across the city.
We have time for one more question.
Hey, my name is Alexis Willis, and I'm a commercial real estate broker here in town. And so the last decade, I've worked with entrepreneurs and felt like commercial real estate was another way to support them in a different part of the life cycle of their business, and that has proven to be true. But I've also realized that commercial real estate is how cities change. So it's the commercial real estate is, whether or not we have a grocery store in a neighborhood, or different things that we need, right? And so I find myself when I'm listening to these types of discussions, they revolve a lot around residential needs. Have you seen in your work where commercial real estate can also impact creating a more equitable space for, spaces that look like us? Because I see some things, without getting too deep, in my industry that lead me to believe that those same systemic issues permeate the commercial space as well, if not deeper than residential, because the pockets are deeper in commercial. But anyways, so my question is, what have you seen about the work that you've done and how it impacts commercial real estate, the commercial space?
So yeah, we had a meeting earlier with Pathway Lending, and so small business development, that's my next battleground in this work for sure. So thank you for that question. So I think I would come back to the work I mentioned as a part of Elevated Chicago, because part of what we are looking at is not just how we're building more residential, but mixed use development around transit. And I think I've been able to take this model that I've been developing and get those lenders to be a part of the conversation. So I mentioned the community ownership piece, but another part of this that we look at is franchises. So there's been a heavy focus on getting entrepreneurs in the door and into these brick and mortars, but there's entrepreneurs of all different scales that I think we miss, like our micro retail, our caterers, right? Folks that aren't ready to be in that space but could share a space. So one development I think has been particularly successful around that is the Hatchery in Chicago, and they took a model around gathering lots of entrepreneurs and saying, well, we can't, what if we pulled our resources together and were able to participate in a shared kitchen model and have more of an incubator space for these businesses. So I think that has been one example that has been super helpful. And another example I'll share is in a South Side neighborhood of Woodlawn. We not only looked at, are we getting minority-owned businesses into commercial development, but how are we thinking about franchises? And is that one step into this process for someone to build up their assets, build their balance sheet, to then go into a conversation with commercial lending? So I think we often cut folks off in even thinking about this as a viable pathway for them, because they don't have the track record or they don't have the collateral to be able to do that type of lending needed to enter commercial spaces. But I think if we can get folks to think about a shared ownership model as a stepping in point, or a franchise as a stepping point, we can get more folks in the conversation around commercial real estate lending. So I'm working on them next, but would love to talk more about your work.
Hi, I work at a nonprofit here in Chattanooga that does a lot of work surrounding affordable housing, and so we work a lot with LIHTC, and we attempt to get LIHTC, but we have noticed that Chattanooga doesn't score very high compared to cities like Knoxville. There's, I think, a 20-point disparity that Knoxville gets over us, and so I was just curious what your thoughts are about how we could get more Chattanoogans to know about the way that LIHTC affects them, and also the scoring process maybe, or just get them more energized about the concept of affordable housing and the way that our state agency, the THDA, Tennessee Housing Development Agency, doesn't actually continuously fund that adequately for us here.
Yeah, so I would say I definitely thought a lot about that during the engagement process for the racial equity impact assessment, because we were asking residents to comment on it, and they were like, "What's a LIHTC?" And we were like, "Oh, it's the building you live in." And they said, "What's a LIHTC?" You know, so like having actual accessible information to break that down, and I think starting with who are going to be your champions, which are the current residents of LIHTC properties, and hearing the good, bad, and ugly of what it might look like to live in that place. I think those are the folks you want to start with, and thinking about what are the educational tools that you can develop. And so for me, it was about, as an artist, using user personas to make this work accessible, but I think there's lots of different tools. I'm always going to be a advocate for the arts, but I think there's lots of ways that you can break down these complex systems into thinking about what people's specific incomes are and helping them to understand what you then have access to in this unit that allows you to keep this particular income. So I think there's lots of ways that you can break down the storytelling of it, but I would start with how are you getting the word out about what this particular tax credit allows people to do, and to have the people that live there be your champions and advocates for this and collecting their stories. But we can also talk about like what's in the QAP for Tennessee and like, you know, what the scoring might look like and how we can get some people on the phone. But I think all of that should be at least a starting point for how you're thinking about it.
Thanks to everyone for those questions. We'll leave it to, thank you, Chandra, and leave it to Eric to wrap things up for us.
Wow, Chandra, thank you. I'm, for one, very inspired by your work. I think you are very emblematic of what I've often heard, that urban planners are described as knowing a lot about a lot, is one of the skill sets, and also a community creative that shows up with deep empathy. And so I'm touched by your work. I'm impressed, and so thank you for being here tonight. One more Chattanooga. Thank you so much. Please mark your calendars. As we always do, we have another Civic series in this great lineup of speakers for you, beginning next year in February 22nd to be exact. We will have Gil Penaloza here. If you have not heard of Gil Penaloza, he is the leader of 880 Cities. It's headquartered in Toronto. It's a nonprofit organization that he donates his own time and his treasure to lead. 880 Cities is a movement that is really interested in creating cities that are for everyone, and including those from ages 8 to 80. If we focus on those two age groups, Gil believes that we'll create cities for everyone. And so please look for more information from us. Look for signups. We'll have those up very soon. And stay tuned. Our website is a great resource to have all of the access that you'll need to sign up for any one of our events, but especially at ChattanoogaStudio.com/civic. You can follow us anytime also on Facebook and Instagram. Our social media pages are a great resource for you to have access to these programs. I want to end tonight. Is Ray still here? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Ray, but as we led into, I think this is a great full circle for Chandra's talk and what we've been through tonight. As we led into the show that Chandra was featured on with Scenic Roots, Ray, I think, led an intro to that Scenic Roots episode on WUTC that I think it's worth everybody meditating and leaving here tonight with, if you wouldn't mind. Ray said, quote, "For cities, urban design is at its best meant to put people first and center them with a sense of place. However, sometimes the neat lines of a design on the page or in the mind's eye stand in the way because those lines miss how people and places live in practice," end quote. I think that was spot on, and I really appreciate Ray and Chandra for everything you've done to make this Civic a very memorable event, and I hope that tonight resonates with you, and tonight inspires you to think about Chattanooga in a different way and to be engaged yourself to make Chattanooga a better place for everyone. Thank you for being here tonight, and I really appreciate it. I'm sorry. I'm seeing Ginger say one more thing. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, we do have Chandra's book in the front, I believe, right? And I mentioned it at the intro, Where the Sidewalk Grows. It's there for you to possibly purchase, and definitely take a look through the book, and it's available for you to purchase in front. So thank you again for being here tonight. Thanks, Ginger, for reminding me. Appreciate you all being here. Good night.